I think I have a great loud voice anyways. So, next up we have Helen Kopnina. Forgive me if I don't pronounce that right.
She's not gonna, next person, she's actually going to...
Oh, okay. Flip over. Sorry, guys. So we have Terry. Terry Hurtado, an activist. He organized the first anti-bullying demonstration in the city of Cali in 1996. Anti-bullfighting. I said anti-bullying, excuse me. Since then, he took all sorts of legal and nonviolent direct actions against the bullfighting industry. He took part of banning the pull wagon horses at county capitals of Colombia and the use of wild animals in circus. He also stopped the biggest horse parade of the country. Currently a member of the Federation. Excuse me, you guys don't know this. He runs the Animal Liberation School, and he has undertaken several editorial projects, and currently is the director of Vida Libre, Free Life magazine, and he participates actively social and environmental issues, and he's a vegan activist.
And he will be presenting Building Space for Animals in Colombian Peace Process. Colombia has been in a political armed conflict over 50 years in which dozens of thousands of humans have been killed, kidnapped, or disappeared. Nonetheless, the lack of information about how many non-human animals have suffered directly by the armed conflict is enormous. This lack of information has many factors: no recognition of animals as subjects or even objects, affected or targeted by the parts in conflict. The intention to avoid economical penalties. This presentation will be about the ongoing endeavor of the Colombian animal rights movement to include non-human animals and the reflection about peace in Colombian society. The journey goes through many actors to achieve this. Victim associations, political movements, parties, government, and the guerrillas. It will also introduce interpretive framework to think peace with animals. This is an ongoing process that aims to achieve the recognition of non-human animals, of the political and legal status of victims of the political armed conflict in Colombia. It also is looking forward to create commitments within the government and the guerrillas for non-human animals of truth, no repetition, and reparation as part of the construction of peace in the political armed post-conflict period. The animal rights movement is aiming to achieve the will of the peasants and the ex-guerrilla members that will be supported by state projects to prefer economical activities which don't require the use of non-human animals.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, ICAST, for making this conference happen. I think I'm going to read a bit from here because I have some slides, so I will be able to get the slides going. Well, I'm going to first do a little bit of a context of Colombian war, and then another section would be about what does peace mean, and the proposal, a little proposal that's in a building process of a framework to think about animals and peace. And finally, a little bit of our journey and our aims in this process. So, Colombia is in South America. It's in the north corner of South America. You see it over there. And as you could see Florida and probably the southern part of Colorado in the States. So it just gives you a little bit of sense of where Colombia is. It's a fairly big country, mostly if you compare with European countries. I made a commitment in 2011 that I would start each presentation that I did remembering her. She's called Sandra Cuellar. Sandra Cuellar is an environmental activist. She's vegetarian. We worked for more than a year in the national referendum to achieve water as a fundamental right. This was a grassroots endeavor that was a very interesting one. But she was disappeared in 2011, forcibly disappeared. We don't know nothing about Sandra since then. And as her, there are thousands of people disappeared. So to honor all those friends and mates with which I have worked with and have been murdered or forcibly disappeared in Colombia, I would start each of my presentations since then, remembering her as a way to remember all of them. So I've already started Colombian context. This is the context. FARC is 52 years ago. It's a more than 50 years old guerrilla. 52 years ago, while the Cold War was in the peak of its tension, remember 1962 was the crisis of the USSR missiles in Cuba. Two guerrilla movements began in Colombia. The FARC, in Spanish it stands for Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, and the ELN, the National Liberation Army. These guerrillas are hereds of the called period of violence, period in which an extreme violence between members of the two parties of that time, liberal and conservatives, took place. Their way out, the liberal and conservatives, of the violence was an agreement between the elites called the National Front, in which the president would switch from one party to another every election. But this agreement didn't take into account how to address the basic needs of people. This unjust pact between the oligarchies was the seed in which the guerrillas would sprout. During 12 years, in our past two president periods, massive propaganda was made from the state positioning Colombia's army as heroes, and many people lost a critical approach to what they were doing. This included the use of non-human animals. Even most of the animal protection movement overlooked what was happening with animals in the Colombian police and army. In 2012, the current government of the FARC, the current government and the FARC started a peace negotiation process. Since the peace process started to advance, part of the animal protection movement began a campaign for the peace of animals, or include animals in the peace process. In August of this year, the government and FARC came to an agreement. The acceptance of the agreement was taken to validation on a referendum that took place the 2nd of October. Voting yes would validate the agreement, but the no one, which was promoted by the right wing, is very much with just the sense and the feeling you had a week ago with Trump. So the president, Juan Manuel Santos, is the responsible for the peace negotiation. He just won the 7th of October. He was given the 7th of October the Peace Nobel Prize. The second section, the peace process, an opportunity to revalidate our moral community. Let's take back this too. War leads to a place in which most of the times, especially for troops, the others are not acknowledged as equals. The others are pushed out of our moral community. This makes easier higher levels of violence and terror. The attempt of international humanitarian law is to regulate armed conflicts, protect life of civilians and of who are not taking part of the combats, to pursue respect for their physical and moral integrity. Nonetheless, Colombia is one of the cases in which international humanitarian law has failed. Even relying on the most moderate data, the numbers are horrifying. During 1958 to 2012, we have 218,000 people that have died as a consequence consequence of the political armed conflict. But only 19% have been combatants, either soldiers, guerrillas, or paramilitary members. Paramilitary forces in Colombia are ultra right-wing, whereas 81% have been civilians. Murders have been of the various forms. Selective murders, I'm just going to go through the data because, through the slides because of the time, so you could have a sense of it. You can see the cases and who are responsible in each slide. Murders, selective murders, then terrorist attacks, massacres, but not only in war has the face of death, other aspects bring much suffering. Forced disappearance, 25,000%. One of them is Sandra Cuellar, the girl I just showed you in the picture. Sexual violence, kidnaps, and forced displacement. It's as bad as countries that are currently at war, as Syria. The data shows how combatants are not only the ones excluded of moral consideration during war. Civilians are excluded as well. And what is a peace process? Yes, of course, it's about the end of war, but it's more than that, especially in a 50-year-old armed conflict as the Colombian one, in which the others have been demonized. A peace process is about integrating or reintegrating to the prevailing legal and social order. Maybe that also means making some changes in it. Peace is also about inclusion or re-inclusion of a group of people to the moral community. So, one of the deepest aspects of a peace process is the revalidation of our moral community. And if the window is being opened for others to enter to our moral community, why don't we open it a bit more and broaden our sphere of moral consideration to incorporate non-human animals? Interpretive frameworks to think peace with non-human animals. Nature and non-human animals are starting to be acknowledged as subjects by a growing number of people in Colombia. And also as subjects that are feasible to come under violence. When I say this, I mean animals, if I rip this paper apart, nobody would think I'm making an violence action. It's not violent to rip a paper. The paper doesn't feel because we don't acknowledge it as something that's capable of being affected by violence. But now is that what's happening with animals? We are acknowledging that violence could be done on animals. If I make myself clear, I hope. For instance, FARC has used on several times horses to transport and explode dynamite in front of military targets. They have also used dogs for the same purpose. Paramilitary forces used dogs in their front line to attack, manipulate reptiles and dogs as instruments of torture. They use animals as well to make dynamite explode. Military forces, government forces, use dogs to track guerrilla and search mines. The police uses horses as a way to transport riot police units. And the anti-riot use horses as weapons against civilian protests. But non-human animals not only have been instruments of war, they have also been loot of war, or used by all parties as a way to damage indirectly their enemies. Collateral damages also could be claimed as an affection that wildlife suffers during combats and bombing. We should not forget to account the affection that non-human animals suffer by the economical projects linked with violent methods, in order to get them ongoing, as the dispossession of land to peasants, campesinos. This brings up the discussion about nature and non-human animals as subjects of peace. So, how to approach these new subjects of peace? One way is to look into how could the views of the animal protection movement could fit in the peace framework. To do this, I will go through some basic peace concepts following Galton. So, direct action, direct violence, direct violence is a play. When there's direct violence, there is a play with intentions about the consequence of violence. When there's structural violence or indirect violence, there is not a play with intention of violence. The structure is the medium through which the violence is transmitted. Galton also calls it field of violence. I like more that one, although structural violence is more used, more mechanicist. Cultural violence, it's symbolic. It could be found in language, arts, science, religion, education, and its function is to legitimize structural and direct violence. Galton gathers and puts forward two ways to understand peace: negative peace and positive peace. Negative peace is the one that says no to war, no to violence. Is peace understood as the reduction or absence of violence? Positive peace, on the other hand, is the one that says yes. Yes to bring better living conditions in order to avoid the appearance of violence. For the animal protection movement, it seems like the concept of peace is different between the animal welfare approach and the animal rights approach. It could be held that the concept of peace for the animal welfare approach is equal to the fulfillment of the 5 freedoms that we probably all know. So freedom from hunger and thirst, freedom from discomfort, freedom from pain, injury, or disease, freedom to express normal behavior, freedom from fear and distress. On the other hand, animal rights approach, the concept of peace would be the acknowledgement of non-human animals as subjects of their own life, that are allowed to have their own experience. For this approach, the way to make peace tangible would be achieving the animal rights movement goals pointed out by Reagan. The total abolition of the use of animals in science, the total dissolution of commercial animal agriculture, and the total elimination of commercial and sports hunting and trapping. So if we built a little table, kind of have an overlook of some categories of analysis that could be or are used in peace framework, and kind of overlap with what this could be understood by the animal rights and animal welfare movement and approach, what we would find these elements that, of course, this is in a process of construction. This could be understood as a draft, so it's very welcome, all the criticisms. We could think, or we could see that animal welfare has as a main value human life and human interest, where animal rights have as a main value equality in moral rights within all individuals. The concept of peace, then, for animal welfare would be allowed to live, and the 5 freedoms that we just looked into. The animal rights on the other hand, their concept of peace would be subjects of their own lives and having their own expression. I refer to non-human animals. And the relation with animals from an animal welfare approach is of understanding them as property and as resources. Whereas the animal rights approach acknowledge that they are individual with intrinsic value and they are not resources. The animal welfare approach understands the type of violence or acknowledge the type of violence as direct violence only, whereas the animal rights acknowledge more in a structural violence, of course, the direct violence as well. The type of peace from the animal welfare would be the negative pieces. That means the peace that looks the absence of violence, where the animal rights has a more positive understanding of peace and a structural one. The peace action of peace from the animal welfare would be the eliminate cruelty and the reduction of suffering. Whereas the animal rights would be eliminate suffering and the three goals that we just looked into. And finally, in which time would that happen? Well, animal welfare is gradual as they look through regulation, mostly in law, and the animal rights could be also gradual, but as well there are some positions about being immediate, something immediately. Yeah. But this is just a first attempt in which is still to be included other approaches of animal protection movement and of the peace framework. For instance, we are not considering the imperfect peace or unfinished peace approach. Peace for non-human animals. In February of this year, took place a national gathering of anti-bullfighting organizations. In it was presented the talk, Anti-Bullfighting, an Instrument of Peace, in which was made an invitation to reflect about the peace process as an historical moment and what it meant for the anti-bullfighting movement. In this gathering, we agreed that we would send a letter to the president and to the commanders of the FARC and ELN. The main points of this letter was asking them to tell the truth of how animals were used in the armed conflict, acknowledgement of non-human animals as victims of the armed conflict, re-establish affected ecosystems by the conflict, declare that non-human animals should not take part of the armed conflict or of war, commit to not use non-human animals as war instruments or in any type of military or police operations, or by armed forces or with violent purpose. Work with animal protection organizations in order to incorporate reflections about animal rights and raise awareness in members that participated in the conflict and with the victims of it. Work with animal protection organizations in order to get started productive alternatives that don't involve the use of non-human animals. And finally, acknowledge non-human animals as sentient beings and in itself, and that have interests of their own. Therefore, it's desirable to acknowledge them as part of the moral community. We also looked for having conversations with victim associations and social movements. Unexpectedly, the response from the victims was positive. So far, the victims have understood that animals are also victims in the terrible violence of Colombia. With social organizations, it has been a little bit more challenging, but important statements has included in declarations made by the beginning of August, signed by strong movements. This declaration, in a little part, says, peace should guarantee a system of truth, justice, reparation, and dignified victims, including animals affected and degraded nature. both from armed conflict and economic development that destroys territories. Last minute. We also pursue to introduce animal issues in the structure of representation created for peace issues, which will gain a bigger relevance during the post-armed conflict period. In that sense, we reached to include a place for animal protection movement in the State Committee of Peace through a state law. Just before the referendum, there were done activities in Cali, Bogotá, as performance and a march that to claim peace for animals. Finally, oh, okay, I was rushing. Okay, I already finished. Finally, we would ask for the participants here as organizations, as scholars, as collectives, and as individuals to support this fight, this cause in Colombia, through sending a collective letter. We could, if you like, if you agree, of course, as probably one of the conclusions of the conference, or to the president and the two guerrillas. The ELN negotiation, or the peace negotiation with the ELN just started 2 or 3 weeks ago, making a requirement in maybe a sense near the ones we send from the animal rights movement in Colombia. So thank you very much. Oh, just the last thing. And all this is to, I want to introduce Eve. Eve is a girl I have been living with a month and a half ago. She's staying with me because her human mom had to refugee out of the country. So she is an indirect victim of violence in Colombia. She's waiting to all, you know, immigration, sanity, health things to go on. So probably in 2 to 3 or 4 months time from now, she could meet with her human mom again. But this is a face of one of the non-human animals affected by Colombian war.
So we would like to invite Dr. Frisco back up and Terry to kind of have like a panel where you guys can sit here and we can hold a discussion and you guys can ask any questions that you may have. So I have a question for you, Terry, actually. So regarding your Federation of I was wondering what like current or recent projects or activities you guys participated in.
Well, we have our strongest campaigns are about events that use animals. So bullfighting circus that was banned in Colombia 2012. Horse parades, in Cali was a 5,000 horse parade, the biggest one in the country, really nasty. That's kind of our biggest focus. We do veganism, awareness. We have some legal actions also against the government. So there's bull wagging horses. We want to demand, like we use all forms of fight. So we use legal demands and we use demonstrations and more education as well, doing the school for animal liberation, doing talks, doing tabling, and this is taking a lot of energy as well.
So for Marco, so you gave us a nice discussion on your legal theory for animal rights, and how does that work in Italy? In Argentina, for instance, recently a judge used animal rights as a way to free a chimpanzee. But how does the courts and the legal world of Italy consider your perspective?
Based on my researches, the Western countries have pretty the same rules when it comes to animal rights, and that means that they actually do not recognize at all animal rights. Those are welfarist laws that are intended just to protect human sufferings towards animals, and it is a fact. As we can see that one who beat a dog in the street may be punished, but we usually make a massacre just to eat. So I don't really consider our laws in any way protecting animals. I think that we have to recognize them as subjects of rights in first place, and my theory is just about that, because the only subject of rights is the human being, and that's of course because are we that make laws, and until we cannot include different subjects in those laws, then they will be arbitrary laws, and then there is no moral values. There are no moral values in that laws that can be represented at all.
Any other questions?
Question for Terry. I found very powerful your invocation of your colleague at the beginning of your talk, and the way you ended with another colleague's dog with the requirement. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the demographics of the activists with whom you're working in Colombia. You know, where do they come from? Who are forming alliances? And just talk a little bit more about the activists.
Yeah, well, that depends on the topics. Colombia has a very interesting, like, trendy animal awareness happening, but it's very much animal welfare. So there, you know, every day you open Facebook and there's a new animal rescue group, and mostly in big cities, but even in small cities. That, you know, in South America, a small city, it doesn't have like good education. It's usually within the country is several years behind what's happening in the cities about, you know, what's the discussions that are taking place. So that is interesting. It's happening like all over the place. And then in the capitals of the county, of the state, Bogotá, Medellín, Cali, the three biggest cities is where most things are happening. About peace, basically it's Bogotá and Cali, the ones that are more like leading this a bit. And then there are other cities like Manizales, Armenia, Pereira, Pasto. They are capitals but are smaller cities. They are capitals of their state, they are smaller cities. So we just went through an election, a local election for mayors and these city councilors. And there was so much like happening in the demand of people, and because the animal concern is very, you know, not the organizations as well, but the people that have concern about animals are very mainstream. So they were demanding organizations to run for elections. And this was interesting but risky at the same time, because the parties noticed it and they started to say, okay, we have a chance here. And people that had no idea about animals started to from the parties to run. But in some cities, animal activists run for elections, and now, in a really unexpected way, we have like in 9 capitals of the country, animal activists in the city councils. So that's has been like an interesting thing. It has some, the radical organizations are really were the less of it. You know, with let's say the animal rights, the most radical were just a few. So those aliens are sometimes difficult. In Bogota, well, they have more press there, and maybe not the most radicals get to press there. So.
Also for Terry, so the distinction between animal welfare and animal rights, there's something that I didn't hear, and maybe you said, but I think generally people that are coming out for animal welfare really restrict what they're, like the animals they're thinking about to a few groups of animals. Like here in the States, Humane Society will look at domesticated cats and dogs that we use for pets. Sometimes you'll have a wild animal sanctuary, but all of those organizations still eat animals and subjugate animals, but they don't see it that way. And I think generally an animal rights advocate would really look at all species, and I'm just curious about that because I didn't hear that.
Thank you for that. That's a great feedback. Absolutely agree with it, and I'll include it in the table. Absolutely.
Sorry, once again for Terry. I was wondering, would you go into a little bit more detail about your work getting circuses banned, specifically what you think the actions that were truly the tipping point, and kind of thinking in general also what might be successful things in the States, how to apply?
Thank you. That's a good question, mostly when we're in international like setup. It's a long-term fight that started at the end of the 90s with actions like kind of trying to use the local norms to take away animals from circus. That only works sometimes. There were corruption in the environment authority, municipality authority. Protest definitely was a very good element, but more than protest, what we did in Cali at the beginning, or at some point what we realized, was not only the protest, but also, like the protest was taking place, and we had a special group that talked with parents and talked with children. So each time we made a protest in front of the circus, we made 10, 20, 30 families leave. And that was money, a lot of money they were losing. And that was very interesting. Also, going to schools and talking with children in schools about it, that helped. So there was kind of a tipping point where before nobody really was aware of it. Even people said, oh, why are you going to ban circus? You first, you know, it has to be banned first bullfights. There's more blood, it's more explicit. So even the people from circus said, you're not going to ban us. You know, first you're going to ban bullfights, and so we're safe. Well, because economic and political details of Colombian context, it wasn't like that. The other thing, and why I'm saying this question is very interesting in an international context or setup like this conference, is that even though we went several times to the parliament to present bills, this didn't succeed for many reasons, technical reasons. We didn't have enough experience at the beginning. Well, but there was a player that was key. even if we have, some difference with it, that was an international organization that came to the country. So they did two interesting things. One, they exposed what was happening in circus through an undercover investigation. So they had the budget to, go do that investigation, get the equipment for it, pay, this being streamed, managed to get the things filmed, whatever they did, to get it filmed, and take that to the public. That was really important. And the second thing is part of actually a kind of a colonist set mindset that still is in the country. When someone comes from aboard an international organization, mostly authorities would hear you more. So that was really important. And maybe they tried at the end to get with all, like saying, well, we did it almost alone, which wasn't like that. But they played a key role. And that's why international solidarity from grassroots organizations is really important. So no big NGO, like mainstream NGO would come and take over. But if we work in international solidarity between grassroots organizations, well, that hear from that availability to hear and openness from the government will still be there, but we'll be working on what we're trying to build, an alternative and a more radical approach.
I have a question for Carlo. Under your proposal for these unconditional rights, do you feel that a system of kind of juridical law could exist under that, or it would have to be completely done away with? Whereas if a law couldn't apply to, like, say, any kind of matter, then it wouldn't be just under that law.
Well, I don't think that we can find any solution in laws, because, as I said, they are just a tool for who make those laws to keep its influence, its power, and its privileges. And we can see it always happening in politics and in laws. And therefore, I think that we should not think about our future with better laws, but without laws at all. The problem is just that we need laws today because they are just expression of a social-cultural context, and our social-cultural context is not ready or mature enough to exist without laws, because we are not mature and independent from that needs that laws just grant and recognize. I think that we should concentrate about ourselves and about our perspective of the world and about what we consider other than ourselves. Because once that we consider all the same, me, you, animals, this table, maybe the tree that it was, then we can realize that we cannot save or protect one and just one of these, but that saving one means saving all of these elements involved in the same system. So I think that in our future we have to, how can I say, it's not possible today to live without rules or laws, but of course our final destination should be that to remove at all laws and to become more mature, more independent from such perspectives that made laws possible and also need today.
So I have a question for both of you guys. Assuming that humans will consciously integrate animal rights into their lives, what type of changes do you predict will happen in society with that change?
If all society was animal rights? Oh, that would be interesting. That's where well, probably the three things that Regan is calling us to do. That would be the beginning, at least. I don't know. I think that's kind of a unfolding process that's full of surprises and of cultural, contextual experiments. So if the U.S. became animal rights and Colombia became animal rights, what would happen in each country would be probably totally different. First, because in the U.S. you have factory farming. In Colombia, well, we have it, but in a smaller scale. So you would be probably using those buildings of factory farming for something else. Whereas in Colombia, we would reduce the almost 40 million hectares that are in grazing to something else. And the freedom, how would freedom look like in Colombia for those cows and bulls would be absolutely different than how would it be for the ones living in the U.S. I don't know, that would be very interesting to see and to make it happen.
I think that this is a little more complicated than we can expect, because when we talk about veganism, of course we are talking about saving some lives, but not respecting all animals, because if we are really taking seriously the animal rights concept, then we have to approach also those wild creatures that we are making extinct, because if we see our countries, our towns, our cities, the way we make buildings, houses, streets, then it's just irrespectful for any other beings than humans. So when I build something like we do, then I make no longer possible that animals use that land, so they cannot survive if we don't change our minds. But this is a radical change, because it's our system and our thoughts that are misleading us, and that are making also the environment no longer as our house, but a place unsuitable for us, as well as for non-human animals, for plants, for every kind of life. So I think that it is really hard to understand what we should do about animal rights. And as I said, I don't think that we can separate those rights from human rights or for the respect for the environment, because we have to imagine that all the creatures of this planet, as well as of the universe, are connected and the same thing. So once that we understand that connection, then we can make a correct change. But if we don't have clear where we are going to, then we cannot make the changes really good, but they are just illusion. But I think that also about veganism, sometimes I hear people that say well, I'm saving the world through veganism. Well, I don't think that's enough. It's a starting point maybe, but we have to change more than just our eating. We are eating not actual food, and sometimes even when we eat plant food, it's not actual food for us. So we have to change radically our lives, and that's the only way to change also our perception of respect, and of course not just for animals but also for other humans.
This is for Carlos. In the pure form of your philosophy that you're suggesting, how would we live? Because if you're going to respect the tree and the carrot, how do you actually live? What is our food?
That's a good question. When I started to study for my PhD thesis, I've been vegetarian for 12 years. Then I became vegan. But once that I started studying, the first question was, well, is that true that humans have to eat meat? And then I realized that that was not possible, because to eat meat we have the need for some tools, for fire, because we cannot hunt or eat meat as it is. And we also don't feel hunger when we see a cow, maybe in front of a stick, but the stick is the result of a transformation, and only after the transformation we can eat that. So it is not in our nature. But then I realized that also many plant food is the result of a transformation. When we discuss about natural cuisine, we are talking about something misleading, because cooking everything means transform it, alterate it from its real nature. So in nature, only what is suitable for us to eat as it is actual food for us. And I mean basically fruit. So this is the first change that we should have in our minds, that fruit is the only suitable food for humans. As you can see, it's hard to make such change in our lives, but I think that once we are clear the point, then we can make all the changes that we want, but we have to be clear and honest with ourselves. Once I did not eat fruit at all. Then I realized that it was our only actual food, and it was hard for me to realize that, because that meant that I was not eating actual food, and that I had to change my life. I'm not actually eating just fruit, but I made some changes, and I think that we all can do that.
So I'd like to propose one more question for both of you guys. Do you think that this change in consciousness can happen within a capitalistic society?
I think there's a change happening, even in capitalist society, but a change that has its limits, its borders, and it's a change that is, it pursues the survival of capitalism. So it's probably a change that's not going to be deep. I think capitalism is very flexible and very kind of shapes into what it needs to shape in order to survive. That consciousness that we call it, because it's first, I think it's also kind of to think about what kind of consciousness are we finally talking about. Even though we speak of animal rights, people could be understanding different things and take the discussion of different levels of what does that mean for animals that we today don't acknowledge, and specism just is not even question about animals as insects, for instance. But short answer is no, not enough at least.
Well, I agree, because I think that capitalism is one of the first things that we have to change, as well as consumerism, that is leading us to the extinction. So until we realize that we should find other values in our lives, then we are condemned, not just as individuals, but also as a societies. So the first purpose of our change should be in that direction. And it is the same about food. Once that the meat industry realize that people change their mind, they will not die, but they will change their offers to the public, but the means will be always the same. And as well as they are exploiting animals, they will be exploiting the environment and the humans as well. So it's a completely different way of thinking on which we should be focused. And maybe that all that changes are connected.
If I could add something more, is that changing capitalism or destroying it is not also the solution. Won't be the solution. Probably will be part of it, because the specialist mindset is previous to capitalism, at least as I see it, as probably other forms of discrimination, not all but others. And capitalism, what does is exacerbate it, radicalize that way of discrimination. So we have to go even more deeper to the roots of that what capitalism influence and animal exploitation and domination.
Thank you guys. We are out of time. We really
Thank you.
appreciate
Thank you.
the discussion. And yeah, we'll invite our next facilitator up. Is that you, Jen? Jen? Cool. Is Gabriella here?
She was here, maybe she just stepped out. She did, okay. Cool. Mara, Gabriella, and Matt, maybe. Yeah. Would you like to come up to the table?
Sure.
Great.
Can you just sit?
Yeah, that'd be
For
great.
Matt or Matthew?
Matthew's good. Yeah.
Alright, so do we just want to...
If you can, make sure to hold the mic next to you. We are videotaping and then live streaming. So people are watching this around.
Inspired by In the Presence of Buffalo, Daniel Rister's narrative and historical exploration of the allegiance of the BLM and ranchers at Yellowstone National Park. This paper explores the connections between the violence committed by ranchers, vigilante groups, and government agencies in the borderlands of Arizona. In this exploration, I use the framework of critical animal studies to identify themes of narrativist environmentalism, colonialism, and speciesism in the propaganda, rhetoric, and practices of these groups. This thematic analysis makes visible the ways in which these groups historically have practiced and currently practice allegiance to one another in their violence constructing and enforcing borders in Arizona. It also illuminates the importance and intersectional resistance efforts that recognize the interconnectedness of this violence. Mara Pepper is an instructor in the first-year seminar program at Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff, Arizona, teaching courses on animal liberation, holistic justice, and historical trauma and mental health in modern society. Mara is the co-founder in the Flagstaff EcoFem Collective and NAU student-led Total Liberation Action research team. She has spent the last year coordinating student-led research in Northern Arizona, interviewing ranchers and homesteaders connected to the Flagstaff CSA about their practices and attitudes in raising and killing animals. Her interests include queer and eco-feminist resistance, the roles of art and healing and social movements, and the intersections of earth, human, and non-human animal liberation.
Thank you. So, thank you all. Hi. I didn't get a chance to actually write that paper. I'm adjunct faculty at NAU, so I'm really overworked right now. But I have been doing research with my students, like they said, on rancher attitudes and homesteaders, but I'll be focusing specifically on this, interviews with ranchers, attitudes in raising and killing animals. Specifically, we worked with Diablo Trust ranchers. Diablo Trust is actually praised in Flagstaff by a lot of folks in the environmental movement as being this poster child for humane local beef production that is practiced in an ecological way with regard for wildlife. So in my research as a graduate student on total liberation, I was frequently asked by my professors, well, what do you think about Diablo Trust and this amazing alliance between environmentalists and ranchers that has happened in our town in northern Arizona?